How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's kmay and Mozio's David Litwak. Welcome to How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly podcast about innovators in travel and transportation. Today we have Francis Davidson, CEO and founder of Sonder, joining us. Sonder is a major player in the vacation rental world. They run a network of serviced apartments licensed to run as a hotel, allowing them to offer higher reliability and consistency of service and a more comprehensive brand than marketplaces like Airbnb and VRBO. Sonder has 8,500 spaces in 26 cities around the world and is expected to generate $400 million in revenue this year. They've raised $360 million and recently achieved unicorn status. And thank you for joining us, Francis.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we like to start all these podcasts out with the same question, which is to ask you how you got here. So please, would love to learn a little bit how you started your company.
Certainly, I would have never imagined that I'd be an entrepreneur building a company in hospitality and travel. I actually got introduced to the idea as a college student, trying to figure out a way to rent my own apartment out during the summer. I was going back to my hometown, and no one wanted to rent the space. And so I thought, hey, maybe I could rent it to travelers instead. That was 2012. The first thing I did was kind of research online. Hey, I'm in Montreal then. If I want to stay in an apartment in Montreal for a week or a few days, where would I go? And I stumbled upon a couple of websites. The most popular then was actually HomeAway, which had just gone public the prior year. And I just basically ran all the numbers that I could to figure out how much revenue was possible to generate off of the space and how that would contrast against the costs that would have to be undertaken to operate the business, and saw that, there would be an interesting business model where I could just basically take people's spaces that they were leaving vacant for months at a time, pay their rent for them, and then turn around and create some really interesting experiences for travelers that wanted an experience that's a little bit more authentic and off the beaten path. So I did that with my apartment after having kind of done the modeling and entered a competition actually at McGill, which now we're known for have not pursued or went all the way to the finals. We were kind of cut in the first few rounds. But despite this, kept on going. Went back to school after a successful summer, and then the following year rented out a bunch of other people's apartments. I think there was like 6, and that worked really well. And so I decided, hey, we would. My co-founder and I, Lucas, decided to take this to the next level and show a bunch of other people how it was possible to basically take vacant apartments in a city, especially during the summer, during the high season, and have a bunch of people that are happy because their rents are being paid for them. And then on the other side, host a bunch of travelers who would pay a premium to have access to those spaces. So we found a bunch of entrepreneurial college students across, I think, 11 cities. That was in 2014. I was still in college at that point, but once we kind of were in those 11 cities, I basically had to stop attending class and go kind of all in. Basically showing these people how we had done it and splitting the profits with them. So this was still before we'd raised capital, or before, I was aware of what angels or VCs were, or, thinking that, we'd be trying to build a disruptive company. We're just kind of exploring this cool concept. And it actually worked. We ended up making $1 million in sales that summer. And business was profitable. It was working really well, but we wanted to take it to the next level. And so we kind of met up with some local VCs. I basically just emailed one out of the blue being, hey, we're looking for some capital. And I read that you guys do this. You invest in, companies that need capital to grow. And actually I sent that email in French even, which was just a cold email, but we put a couple of stats in there. Hey, we just did $1 million in sales, and we want to raise some money. And they replied, and they got us to come into one of their accelerator called Founder Fuel. Spent a few months there. People started asking, what's the vision for your company? And that's when we actually took a step back and thought about what is now Sonder. This idea that there is an opportunity to create a really amazing brand that guests would love. That it wasn't about the real estate, the supply side. It was about basically bringing a really beautiful space in an interesting neighborhood, a format that really is the diametrical opposite to a soulless downtown beige walled hotel room that costs an arm and a leg, that we could actually bring this authenticity, this uniqueness, this really interesting experience, but in a way where we can drive high quality and consistency because we could manage it to brand standards, and we'd be in charge of making sure that the spaces are clean and that the furniture is nice and that there's service if ever anything goes south. So this concept, people loved, and now there's been a large evolution since that moment in 2014 that we decided we wanted to build a hospitality brand, away from taking on apartments for just the summer and towards now almost exclusively working with developers who are building properties for Sonder's specific use. There was lots of changes when it comes to how we would operate these spaces, and that now we furnish and design them. There's a much greater degree of control with regards to what we're actually offering to the guest. And that has grown extraordinarily fast since then. Like you mentioned, we've raised a few $100 million of venture capital, and every year we've launched to new markets and new geographies, and that leads us to today.
Very cool. I read someplace, and I think maybe you might have echoed this. You talk about building a hospitality brand, and you were quoted as saying you want to build the Marriott or the Hilton of the new economy, whereas Airbnb is more like Booking and Expedia. Could you maybe elaborate on kind of how you think about yourself within what is a very very complicated vacation rental market?
Yeah. So, in its simplest form, you have online travel agencies, marketplaces, basically that connect supply with travelers. And so, Booking.com, I think close to $100 billion market cap. You have Expedia. And Airbnb is a flavor of one of these kinds of, marketplaces. I think they've done some things extraordinarily well, much more design centric, and they've tried to identify supply that priorly wasn't even online. So huge value creation there. But that's fundamentally a very different business than the one that we're involved in, which is about, operating spaces and being in charge of the guest experience from end to end in the same way that, some of the large hotel brands are. The Four Seasons is not an internet company and marketplace. It is a hospitality, operator and brand. And so from that sense, we're definitely lean more in that camp. I think we're bringing technology to the table in a way that allows us to rethink a lot of the operations of the hospitality industry and its cost structure in particular. And I wouldn't also say that, our aspiration is to be a Marriott or a Hilton. I actually find those brands not to be inspiring, not to have, a fan base of people who really, really love those brands. And so I think there's an opportunity to take it a step further and build within hospitality a brand that's more, in the same category as the Apples and the Disneys and the Nikes, something that for sure no hospitality company has managed to do so far. That would be our ambition.
Hi, Francis. It's Kev here over in the UK. We've got loads of questions for you. I mean, I've got one here now. I mean, you've referenced quite a few brands there already: Airbnb, Booking.com, HomeAway, and Expedia. Could you give us a flavour of which ones you've learned from the most, perhaps, and which ones that you think you've deliberately avoided following their strategy because of the way they've done things and it's different to the way you want to do things?
Yeah, so I'd say, none of these companies really provide an operating manual for how to build Sonder, the brand operator. I think, there's the things that we are good at are working with developers and real estate owners to figure out how we might be able to increase the yields they generate on their assets. We're good at, designing spaces and furnishing them, decorating them, photographing them. We're also good at handling guest requests and ensuring that properties are clean and well maintained. So those are capabilities that are really different from any of these companies that you just mentioned. So I'd say, if anything, we take a look at some of the high-end boutique hotels as inspirations from a guest experience perspective. If I think about, Capella Hotels, or if I think about Proper Hotels, or Nomad, or, there's a series of brands that I think really care about culture and design, and that have kind of crafted experiences that give, really create some sort of a symphony of art, of architecture, of food, of service, and they really meticulously consider all of the details. I'd say those are the companies I probably, that we study the most to try and understand like how we might be able to deliver an experience that's truly mind-blowing. A little bit less so the kind of online marketplaces. Although if I had to choose one that I think is doing like a particularly good job, like definitely I think Airbnb's kind of design centric culture from a UI UX perspective is really excellent. The way that they've built kind of trust in their platform, what they've accomplished is really special. So I really love what they've done, but really we're mostly about, the operations of a piece of property, so that guests can really enjoy their stay.
I want to quickly delve a little bit deeper on what you just mentioned about boutique hotels. So I hate to bring up PhocusWire's competitor Skift on this call, but I was at the Skift Global Forum a few weeks ago, and Ian Schrager from Public Hotels and Studio 54, and kind of one of the pioneers of boutique hotels was on stage, and he was talking about how they were rethinking every part of design, from why should there be a person checking you in to why should there be room service, and how they're able to minimize costs and provide a much better experience at a similar price to maybe something that would be typically cost a lot more. So I'd love to that is gets back into a little bit of something you said earlier about how you guys are trying to use technology to minimize your operational costs. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, both more on the boutique hotel side and also on the operational costs and technology?
Certainly. I think Ian's commentary on this topic is absolutely correct, and this is something where we're beyond kind of cheering for the idea that technology can rethink the operations of property. We're actually putting our money where our mouth is and investing really substantially in the building of technology that allows us to operate more effectively at every part of the business. So as an example, when it comes to underwriting and figuring out which properties would be best suited for our use, we have quite a sophisticated approach towards modeling the revenues and the costs and what the expected kind of returns are likely to look like, are likely to be, followed by our, once a property is signed, getting it up and running extremely rapidly. So we actually have a global supply chain built out, where we buy globally, furniture, decoration, artwork, mattresses, cutlery. We have warehouses that are operated with our homegrown software, that's mapped to the platform that designers can use to pick and choose items that will then get put onto trucks and shipped to cities where there's other pieces of software that allow our third parties and our teams on the ground to manage the incoming flow of literally thousands upon thousands of boxes that need to be unpacked and moved and placed exactly in the right place before the photographer comes in. And we managed to do this in a matter of days. And so whereas it takes years for most hospitality projects to come up with soup to nuts, the concepting towards the first guest checking in, we routinely do this in a matter of simply days, and at a cost that's extremely envious to most hospitality companies, despite the fact that our design is kind of celebrated and has been widely published for being excellent. And then, there's more revenue management, I think, is an obvious application of technology. I don't think we're the only ones there, but I think there's been quite a lot of innovation given how diverse our portfolio is. We don't just have 350 rooms inside of one property that all look the same. We have a really diverse set of properties in a series of locations, and so that adds some elements of complexity that have required us to build our own technology. And then the day-to-day operations of the property are probably the most important. Is probably one of the most important things that technology can do. We've basically looked at everything that a hotel can do, and whether it was possible for us to automate that work, whether it was possible for us to simply completely eliminate it because it's a relic of the past. And so I think the couple of examples that you mentioned, like the front desk, for instance, or the room service, we think no front desk is better, and that the front desk should be on your phone actually. That there should be no check-in process, but that you should have 24/7 service available within seconds. But through your phone. And we think that in the era of food delivery companies, there's no need to have, a room service offering at the property level that typically is a loss leader. So yeah, I think we've done a careful job analyzing every single job that is done within a hotel and figuring out how technology might be able to do it in a more efficient manner.
Very cool. I think you answered most of what I wanted to ask in my next question here, actually. But um, there's a lot of focus right now on people using property in creative ways and calling it technology companies with WeWork's IPO implosion. I feel like you just mentioned a bunch of different ways that you truly are using technology. But I'm curious, have you received any blowback? And how do you think of yourselves as a real estate company versus a technology company in that balance?
Yeah, so I think everyone that takes a deep look at our business realizes that there's no way we can offer a bigger, nicer place for a lower cost than a hotel room in a profitable manner without delving deep into technology and that being at our core. So I don't think we're a technology company from the perspective of, we don't sell our technology. We're not a software company that has like a service that you can subscribe to. The technology we use is for our internal use, very much like Amazon and their warehouse and logistics and what powers their e-commerce platform. And there might be a day where we decide, hey, we actually want to package our technology and sell it, but that would be kind of not the core driver. Like what we really care about is extraordinary experiences, like spaces, services that are just jaw-dropping, and to offer those at price points where everyone can afford. And there's really no other way than to build technology in order to do that. So I think it's there's no cause for concern when it comes to, I think, some other companies that pretend to be things that perhaps they're not. What matters for us is just to stay focused on efficiency and quality of experience, and then it just happens that technology is one of those major levers to make that happen at scale.
Francis, Kev here. I don't mind quoting our rival as well, David, so I don't mind if you do. So a year and a half ago, Steve Milo, this is going back to the kind of the impression that people have of the company. Steve Milo, as most people know, the founder and CEO of V-Trips, said in an article with my former colleague Sean O'Neill, what Sonder is practicing is arbitrage. And arbitrage only goes in one direction as the market matures, and it's down. How do you kind of counter that with not kind of, how do you kind of take that kind of criticism on the chin? Is it something that you just take on the chin, or do you kind of fight back with your own kind of response to it? It's fairly vocal, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think I understand where this person's coming from, but I think ultimately it's a misguided idea. I think, for instance, if you're familiar at all with the European market for hotels, the leasing model is extremely prevalent there. If you really think about what Starbucks is that not only just a lease arbitrage from the price of a coffee cup to the price of real estate retail square footage? If at the end of the day, what you're doing, an arbitrage requires basically taking an asset and buying it and then selling it immediately on another market that has a different price for it. But the reality is that we're leasing, entire buildings that are don't come with service, that aren't furnished, that don't come with distribution, that don't come with pricing algorithms built in, that don't come with basically all the ingredients that actually make the experience special for guests and actually drives the business model through the efficiencies that we can bring about. So I really encourage people that think it's an arbitrage to go and sign up 1,000 units and then try and chop them out in 3-4 night stays, without having to build like a colossal organization and capabilities that rival some of the best organizations out there.
Yeah. So you mentioned a word just then, distribution, Francis. I'm curious, just if you can talk us through what the kind of the customer acquisition kind of process has been over the years, and whether you see yourselves as the sole distributor of these properties, or whether there's something wider that you would do with working with some of those OTAs that you referenced earlier.
Yeah, so we've I think great organizations make bets that are a little bit unusual and that take people by surprise, but that consciously do so in order to gain an advantage. And I think one of the things that we've done is be extremely focused on what we're good at. And what we're good at is real estate kind of supply side acquisition, making sure we have a really compelling value proposition for owners. And we're really good at operating properties, both from an experience perspective and from a cost perspective. Like that's where we have an engine, and not all of our resources are really focused on making those things happen. And one of the things that we've decided not to do is, figure out how to, acquire customers directly and compete against the Bookings and Expedias, who are the largest spenders of Google AdWords, to try and build an acquisition funnel. Our view is, let's partner with companies that are really great already at aggregating supply and that already have hundreds of millions of users. And let's just make sure that our stuff's the best on there. Let's just make sure that we show up at the top, that our reviews are really good, that we have like great merchandising, great photography, and and our business model should work as a result of the efficiencies that we bring about, not necessarily because like we were able to outsmart Booking.com, who are notorious for their A/B testing and their extreme levels of efficiency in customer acquisition. That's just not a fight that we think is worth it. We think that much more value is driven by being amazing operators of properties that people love.
Right.
I wanted to quickly rewind. You said something that this is common in Europe. This is the European leasing model. I'm always fascinated when they're in another market people are operating like this, and you bring it to America. Could you maybe detail that a little bit more? What did you mean when you said this was common in Europe?
Yeah, so a lot of hotels are leased in Europe. Lots of owners are actually skeptical of hotel management agreements where the operator brand gets a percentage of revenue, percentage of NOI, and instead just require even the Hiltons to lease, properties from them to guarantee a certain amount of, monthly, annual, payments to the owners. And so it's already a widespread kind of practice within hospitality, not so much in the US, which really thrives on hotel management agreements and franchise contracts. Maybe another thing I wanted to add with regards to the prior point that I forgot to mention is, despite the fact that we have really strong partnerships with our distribution partners and we don't really play the customer acquisition marketing game, what we realize is that people, like when they fall in love with the experience and they just don't believe that, they're staying in the center of London and they paid a fraction of what they would have paid to even stay like 20 minutes outside if they stayed at a Holiday Inn. They're like, holy shit, I want to stay with Sonder again. And either they find us again through these channels, or sometimes they'll go on Sonder.com, or they'll tell other people and they'll go and book direct. So our direct business has actually been increasing incredibly fast. And it's on track to be, despite the fact that we have no marketing spend at all behind direct customer acquisition, it's on track to be the majority of our revenue by 2021.
It's funny, just I know David's got something to ask you, but just quickly on that, Francis, it's quite funny really, because I'm sure you'll recall, if you wind back 8 or 9 years, the commentary around once people come to us and they have a brilliant experience and all these kind of things, it's the same kind of messaging that was used by a certain Brian Chesky of Airbnb when they were 3 or 4 years into their journey. It's the same thing. Would you agree?
I'm not familiar with it, but I can, the basic principle that if people love what you do, they will come back, I think is universally true.
Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into this idea that you guys are actually completely on the right side of the law in every city you operate in. I think there's, this debate that I think a lot of disruptive models go through, whether it's to ask for permission or forgiveness. And obviously Airbnb asked for forgiveness, as did Uber and Lyft, et cetera, in a lot of these markets. And I know you operate as a hotel in certain cities, as a property manager in others. Could you walk us through your thought process on why you chose to operate in this way and completely on the right side of the law?
Yeah, so I think there are many different paths that lead us to that conclusion. One of which is it's just the right thing to do, especially if we want to be kind of key actors in those communities for decades to come. Another thing to consider is that we can't just wash our hands of the of lack of compliance by saying, hey, we're just an online marketplace. I think that argument can oftentimes be used and say, hey, the actors on my platform, I can't be liable for the actions that they will take. If you're a marketplace, that is a fair argument in most instances. For us, though, like we are actually the operators. Like we have our own employees in each one of these cities. We are like our name. If you rent a space from Sonder, like you're renting it from Sonder. You're not renting it from someone else. And so if there's a violation, we're on the hook for it. So that requires a much higher degree of compliance. We also think that, we don't want to grow, especially given the investments that we do into growing cities. We don't want to basically build a portfolio of great properties that we have to, down the line, go away from. We want to build a really long-term business. And so that involves like growth that is going to sustain kind of scrutiny from regulators as our service becomes more and more popular.
Francis, just on that, I mean, it's interesting that you have taken that approach, and some might say a very admirable one. Um, was it tempting at the outset, though, to perhaps follow other models, just because, as David referenced, the kind of apologise later type thing, or deal with things when the regulators come calling? Was there any temptation in those very early days to kind of do it in a different way?
Certainly, I think there's definitely some markets, especially like where we started off, Montreal and Boston, where there was just no regulations for a long time, and it took them years to come up with a clear framework. And so when I started off, like in the early days, we basically took properties that we could get our hands on, but they weren't operating against an existing law. It was just in somewhat of a gray zone. But as that got clarified, then we moved towards full compliance.
So do you feel like you're more of a hotel company because you do kind of operate in that less of a grey area and more of the black and white zones? Would you consider yourselves to be more of a kind of a hotel company then?
Yeah, I think you could call Sonder a lot of things. And a hotel company isn't one I'd puke at. I'd puke on rather. I think it's I think we try to do it very differently. Our inventory and our experience feels nothing like a hotel, even though it has those kinds of licenses and it follows the zoning and taxation and requirements that the hospitality industry is subject to. But one thing that we've announced recently is that we are now also in the hotel business. Like, we don't have just apartments. Sonder also operates hotels. We've looked at and taken on, I think, something like about 20 hotels so far. We have another 40 or more under negotiations currently. And those are properties that we think are, under renovated. They're in really great locations, but they just don't look good, and they're kind of crappy. And they're poorly operated. The operators don't have, the technology that we do, nor do they have the economies of scale to leverage kind of, to bring down the cost structure. And so there's an opportunity that we've seen to actually renovate these properties, make them look really extraordinary, plug in our technology, our operating system, and then the guest loves them more. They're willing to pay more, and the profits for the property go up, and we can share those profits with the owner. So this is Sonder is not just an alternative accommodations company, even though that was kind of our opening. We think that the application of design and technology can work across all accommodation categories, hotels, and eventually villas. You can think even about glamping. We want to have a holistic brand for all accommodation categories, and eventually also expand that over to residences, for which we have a pilot in a few buildings in San Francisco currently.
Did you, so last one from me, I promise, for a while. I mean, did you have a big vision when you started? And the reason why I ask is that, in a way, and for fear of saying, mentioning Airbnb again, but, it was 18 months ago that they stopped being just in private accommodation, and they started distributing hotels. And as you just referenced, Francis, you're now working with hotels, and you're giving them you're applying the Sonder magic dust to get them onto the service. I mean, did you have that in front of you in your minds when you first started, or was it just going to be on the kind of the real estate apartment type properties initially?
No, actually, this is something that was added onto the vision, I'd say probably a couple of years ago.
Right.
When we realized that actually what we were good at wasn't necessarily operating apartments, but we just had come up with, without knowing, a better way to operate any hospitality business. And I actually think that the vision is something that's dynamic. I take pride in hiring executives that are strategic thought partners, and we get to kind of co-create what this business will become. And I hope that even the vision that we have today for kind of the holistic hospitality company with all accommodation categories and, and also residences is going to expand over time, and that we're going to, in the right time, kind of, tackle more verticals. The way I see it is this is a multi-decade horizon vision that is dynamic.
Very cool. I want to ask a quick question about brand. And I think obviously, one of the original players in this kind of market was One Fine Stay, and theirs was their brand was incredibly luxurious, very high touch. On the other spectrum, you can stay in a spare bedroom on Airbnb. You guys have purposely chosen somewhat of a middle path, and I'm curious, how do you weigh, what is good enough and what is on brand versus cost?
So our view is, if you look at, if you decompose basically the hospitality business in the United States, in a market, say like Boston, you'll find that you have about 80% of the room count that fits in the, call it mid-scale to upper upscale categories. Those are the spaces that most people will end up staying in. And so what we've done is basically trying to figure out how can we create a superior experience at a price point that the vast majority of consumers can afford. And that really brings us to a mass market product, not a niche for the 1%, not something that only, the extreme budget traveler will benefit from, but something that's like for you and I and most people that we know. So that's what we find is most exciting. It's the biggest TAM. It's the biggest market opportunity. In our view, it's what has the largest. This what has the capacity to have the largest impact on the world. So that's what we're singularly focused on delivering.
It reminds me of, I was having a brand discussion with some friends a few weeks ago, and we were talking about these new brands and how they are able to provide cheaper products without coming across as cheap. So Warby Parker sunglasses no one thinks they're actually, low quality sunglasses. And there are fashion brands that, are much cheaper than Prada, like Everlane, and no one thinks they're cheap fashion brands and that they don't want to be seen.
Great examples.
Yeah, and I feel like this is a little bit of a comment with a kind of an open-ended question here, because I'm curious how you might think about this whenever it comes to your business. I think Airbnb metrics on intimacy and having a local experience, and Warby Parker kind of their other variables like screw the man and the cartel of people who own eyeglasses, and Everlane talks about their local factories, and I feel like they're able to get away with that cheaper product because it's not about being cheap anymore. It's about a better experience in some way, and I'm curious if that kind of has crossed your mind at all.
Yeah, no, I think those are all kind of great brand narratives. And frankly, we still need to develop exactly what Sonder does stand for, given that, again, we haven't exercised the marketing and brand muscle, and we're just such an operations-heavy company. And that I think there's a lot to come there, and there's lots of ideas that we're excited to show the market in the coming year. But I think the ultimate brand is one that is most loved, where the experience is most loved by its customers. And one way to do that is to offer better for cheaper. Like, it's kind of, the most solid business plan is doing it better, faster, cheaper. And so again, if you think about what the perfect hotel room might be, you'd say, okay, well, I want it to look amazing. I want it to be in a great location, maybe locations where there are no hotels in really interesting neighborhoods. Maybe I want a normal room. I want a suite. I want it to be 3 times the size of a normal room. And I want the service to be not modern, not in the way, but I want everything that I want when I do want it immediately. You know what? Let's also make that 20% cheaper than a normal hotel room. And that's basically Sonder. That's literally, if you go on our website, this is what you'll find. You'll find boatloads of these kinds of spaces at these price points. So I think that's the foundation of a really fantastic brand. You just have to deliver. I think another example is maybe Zara, that we take inspiration from. No marketing, but extraordinary logistics, and I'd say really good art direction as well, and great fashion at prices that most people can afford. And I think this is a model which really lacks in hospitality today.
Francis, interesting. So 2014, and forgive me if I've got these figures wrong, they're from Crunchbase. So 2014, 450,000, 2015, a slightly more modest 6.5 million. Then we got up to 11.1, and then 32 million in 2.5 years ago. A year ago, it kind of doubled a bit more, up to 85, and then this year, boom, 225 million. Can you just talk us through really what the funding strategy has been, and what do you sense has kind of really ramped things up in this last year and a half or so? Is it what you've done that's attracted that amount of money, or is it something more about the marketplace that you're operating in around private accommodation?
Well, I'd say the results that we've generated as businesses have explained this. We're by far the largest player in our category, despite having 12 competitors. We're much larger and much faster growing, and so we've been really the pioneers for this. I'd say the reason why we've been able to raise so much money is because we are obsessed with financial discipline and understanding how we might be able to operate a business that is sustainable and that ultimately generates free cash flow. We have this maniacal focus on unit economics, and we've published and we've spoken about some of the details, but the headline is that we pay back our investments in new spaces in about 12 months. We have the contractual right to stay and extend our lease in our properties for up to for 13 years on average. And so pay them back in year one, and then afterwards the rest is gravy. And that's basically very simple investment value proposition. 99% IRRs within Sonder today. You put $1 in and you get $1 out every year for the next 13 years at least, and that number has been increasing over time. And so it's as simple as that for investors to come in. You put $225 million into the machine, and it generates a stream of cash flow that's really substantial over the next decade plus. So I'd say the unit economics is really critical. Understanding, also how to control overhead expenses and just being really disciplined with regards to that. Showing how our earlier markets are profitable and generating cash flow, and just painting a picture that, hey, by the time this company goes public and beyond, the narrative will be really attractive, for investors and folks that are going to want to hold on to our stock.
I wanted to follow up there. You talked about unit economics, and one that's refreshing with all the the WeWork stuff going on. But with a model that has a very clear payback period like that, this is a two-part question. Have you explored alternative financing, figuring out some sort of property acquisition fund that is financed separately outside of venture capital? And I'd also love it if you could talk, kind of related to this, about how you are partnering with these developers, and maybe those two are, one and the same.
Yeah. So I probably multiple times a week I have to fend off the reason why we're not, why we don't have a real estate fund and why we're not buying properties. I think the main reason why people love the idea is because it's just baller. It's so cool. If I could just go to all my friends and be like, hey, we have a $2 billion real estate fund, and look at this. I just got to point some properties and say that we own them and we put our sign on them. It's just it's really cool. And I think it's easy for people to just kind of, get excited about that just because it's a statement. But really, what at the end of the day, what we care about is extending our network as fast as possible, using our dollars extremely responsibly. Last quarter we brought on 3,000 units. Maybe the average value of each one of these units, maybe let's call it $400,000, $500,000. So let's call it $1.5 billion worth of real estate that we add on a quarterly basis, and that's growing at 2.5, 3.5 times a year over year. It's going to be got 10 billion plus worth of assets next year. And the pain that it would be for us to raise capital to buy even just a fraction of that, and the quantity of time it takes to diligence, it's really long. And so it's our view is that we have to grow fast. We have to use our dollars really efficiently. And the best path to do this is the current model that we've developed.
So if you want me quickly interrupting, how do you view venture capital versus debt then? Because if you have a very repeatable model, right, even if you don't buy the property, could you raise debt saying, hey, we have a payback period, this asset is actually extremely low risk, help us blow this up? Have you thought about debt financing? It seems like it's mostly been VC. Yeah,
we have kind of unannounced debt facilities in place that we can use for exactly that purpose. You're absolutely right. If there's a repeatable, clear return that can be obtained, then we can pull on some debt, especially given that there's some assets that we're buying. We're actually buying the furniture and the artwork and the decoration that we're putting in the spaces. So those have a useful life, and so it's reasonable to finance those. Absolutely.
Francis, let's kind of just step back a second, and lots of people throw the word bubble around with regards to private accommodation, and you've more than adequately explained why you've you know, Sonders managed to raise so much money. It's on the unit economics, it's the quality of the experience, etc., etc. But there's a lot of money around anyway. What do you say to those, just broadly, about private accommodation and what you're doing, who say there is a bubble that is potentially has the potential to pop quite badly at some point?
I mean, maybe you could, help me with some names, and I could give you some thoughts with regards to various kinds of business models. Like, I think, in any environment, you're going to see some companies that are disciplined, and you're going to see some companies that are a little bit crazy and don't really understand the financial drivers of their success. In the long run, only the former survive. So whether or not, is there a bubble right now? I'd say, like, my guess is probably not, but happy to, discuss some specific examples.
Maybe it's an inherent skepticism that some have. Maybe it's related to WeWork and SoftBank. Maybe it's just related to the venture market in general, that there is some sense of often money just being thrown into an industry. Let's say that as an industry, rather than just what you're doing or what the sector in which you operate in. What is your kind of view about the venture market as a whole, and specifically with referencing kind of what's been going on in the last kind of weeks and months with the WeWork kind of situation?
Yeah, well, WeWork, it sounds like a surprise to those that hadn't been really following closely their evolution as a business. But I was just reminded by someone yesterday that I expressed my desire to short that company in early 2018, as soon as they did kind of their debt offering. I think, yes, that was a business that was overvalued throughout its life cycle. We actually looked at, the valuation that WeWork had, for instance, at a similar size when they were generating just about the same revenue as we did. Well, first, their unit economics were substantially worse. Like ours are like at least seven times better on an aggressive account of how WeWork's unit economics work. But despite that, they were valued at 5 times more than we are for the same amount of revenue. And they were growing more slowly as well. So all the ingredients that should, the company that's growing more faster, that has better unit economics, should trade at a higher revenue multiple, but WeWork's revenue multiple was 5x greater. And so then, that valuation stays inflated throughout its history. And then it tries to go public at a $47 billion+ valuation. And people are like, actually, this might be worth 10 or less. And we're like, well, no surprise, if they had been valued more reasonably throughout their journey, maybe it wouldn't have been such a disastrous outcome. So I think, there's always going to be examples of irrationality in the markets. I don't think it's systematic. I think there's, some companies that, a bunch of investors put money into out of FOMO because they're growing really fast. They had charismatic leaders that had a really great pitch deck, but not much of a command of the underlying financials and how to create a business that generates cash flow. I think there's, we're bound to see more and more of these happen, but I think we're also bound to see more and more companies learning from these lessons and actually, building a sustainable, solid business, right from the start.
Yeah, let's hope so. David.
Very cool. One last question, then we'll wrap up. In the last couple of days, Google has announced that they're having a vacation rental product, and Booking.com has withdrawn from it, and I think Airbnb hasn't quite decided yet. I'm curious how you view Google in your market, and if you're planning on participating in that marketplace.
Yeah, listen, our view is that our expertise is amazing spaces and services, and we don't want to penalize users that prefer using one website or the other. Like, everyone should, like, Sonders should be everywhere, is how we see it. Like, even if you think about some really powerful brands like Apple, a staggering proportion of their sales, I believe a majority of their sales actually don't come through the Apple stores. Like, they come through distribution partnerships, and you can buy an iPhone at Best Buy, and you could buy one at Verizon store, and so on. So our view is, like, we are building the iPhone, and we want to put it in as many hands as possible. And so I think there's openness on our side. I'm not sure I have the specifics on whether we're going to be included on that platform right from the start. But there's openness towards, expanding our distribution partnerships for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. I'm sure we could have asked you a bunch more, but unfortunately we are out of time. So it only goes for me to say thank you very much to Francis Davidson, from Sonder. You have been listening to another episode of How I Got Here, which is Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly podcast where we talk to the innovators and those behind entrepreneurship and startups in travel and transportation. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next time. And once again, thanks to Francis Davidson. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages, and get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.